Kirana Singh. In the autumn of 1892, when the leaves had just begun to turn brittle under the weight of an early frost, a small village nestled in the shadow of the Carpathian woods seemed to grow darker with every passing day. It was not simply the shortening of daylight that pressed upon the people, nor the early signs of winter that made the air heavy. It was something else, something unseen yet deeply felt. The villagers spoke less, closed their shutters earlier, and clung more tightly to their candles at night. No one could name the dread, but all could sense it lurking in the corners of their homes and the bends of their narrow cobbled streets. It began with a single death. On the morning of October 3rd, the baker's boy discovered his master, Thomas Varga, lying motionless on the floor of his shop. The oven still smoldered faintly, a loaf half-baked inside, but Thomas himself had fallen in the middle of preparing the dough. What struck everyone was not his stillness, but his expression. His eyes were wide open, glassy, and fixed toward the doorway, as if he had seen someone or something standing there. His mouth was frozen in a half-formed scream, but his body bore no wounds, no signs of struggle. He looked terrified, yet untouched. The local doctor examined him and shook his head, muttering that perhaps his heart had failed. But even he admitted he had never seen a man's face so twisted in horror, without a cause. The villagers gathered outside the bakery, whispering prayers and crossing themselves. One old woman murmured, "He saw it. He saw what no man should see." No one dared ask what she meant. Just 3 nights later, another death followed. This time it was young Eva Markovich, a shepherd's daughter of only 17. Her father found her at dawn, slumped against the old wooden fence that marked the edge of their land. Her eyes too were open, staring into the dim forest, as though she had witnessed some unspeakable sight. The strangest thing was the scrap of paper clutched tightly in her hand. No one had ever seen it before. It was old, yellowed as though torn from a centuries-old book. Written in a spidery hand were words in a language half forgotten, but one line stood out clearly in crude Latin letters: "You have seen the truth. Now you must go." The discovery sent a shiver through the village. Fathers forbade their children from wandering after dusk. Mothers lit more candles than usual, tucking crosses into corners of the house, as if they could hold back the encroaching shadow. Yet fear has a way of feeding itself, and whispers became rumors. Rumors became tales, until everyone had their own version of what hunted them from the unseen dark. On the 7th of October, another body was found. This time it was not in the safety of the village, but at the old well on the outskirts, where people once drew water before the stream was dammed. An elderly woman, Katerina, had been found sitting on the crumbling stone rim of the well. Her body was upright, rigid, as though frozen mid-thought. Her head tilted slightly upward, her mouth parted just enough to suggest she had been about to call out. In her lap lay another scrap of parchment, identical to the one Eva had held. Again the same chilling line. The priest, Father Dersen, held mass that evening in a crowded church, lit with dozens of candles, though the flames flickered strangely as if disturbed by invisible draughts. He urged calm, spoke of faith, of resisting the devil's hand. Yet when he returned to his home after the service, he locked every door and window, and prayed not aloud, but in a trembling whisper. Even he could not dismiss the strangeness of those eyes, those wide, unblinking eyes that seemed to die staring at something beyond human sight. By the 10th of October, the count of the dead had risen to 5. A blacksmith, a schoolteacher, and a farmhand had all fallen in the same eerie manner. Each one was found with eyes open, faces carved with terror, and each one had a piece of parchment nearby. What unsettled the villagers most was the discovery that none of the scraps were torn randomly. When Father Derson placed them together on his desk, they appeared to be parts of a single page. The fragments aligned to reveal a longer message, though several pieces were still missing. The words were cryptic, laced with strange symbols, but the refrain repeated again and again. Those who see cannot remain. The air in the village turned oppressive. Dogs barked at nothing in the night. The mill wheel creaked, though no wind moved. Children claimed to see shadows at the edges of their vision, shapes slipping between the trees. Parents hushed them, but their own eyes betrayed fear. Every candle seemed too dim, every silence too heavy. And through it all the deaths continued. On the 12th of October, the 6th body appeared. This one struck the villagers harder than the others, for it was not a laborer, not an elder, but a child of only 8 years. Little Milan had been missing since the evening before. At dawn he was found in the abandoned chapel outside the village, seated before the crumbling altar, as if he had been waiting. His small hands clutched another piece of parchment. His eyes, wide, glossy, unblinking, were fixed on the ceiling beams, where nothing stirred. His mother's scream when she saw him echoed long after the body was taken away. Now the village was breaking apart. Families locked themselves indoors and spoke only in hushed tones. Some packed their belongings and left under the cover of darkness, hoping to escape whatever curse had descended. Others clung to the priest, demanding answers, demanding exorcisms, demanding anything that would end the spiral of death. But Father Derson himself looked aged and hollow, as if the burden of the curse gnawed at his very bone. The strangest part came not from the deaths themselves, but from those who survived. A few villagers whispered of seeing things in the corner of their eyes, faces reflected in darkened windows, figures that vanished when approached, words etched faintly on their walls, though no hand had written them. One man swore he heard a voice in his ear while alone in his barn. "You are next." He left the village that very night, abandoning his farm, his livestock, everything. And yet, there was one who remained untouched in all this chaos. A girl of 11 named Annika. She was the youngest daughter of the tailor, a quiet child who rarely spoke, but who seemed to know more than she should. When asked why she wasn't afraid, she simply said, "Because it already knows me." The villagers dismissed her as strange, but some could not shake the unease in her calm gaze. As the days passed, 7 bodies became 8, then 9, each with the same terrified expression, each with another fragment of the page. The priest collected them, fitting the pieces together in secret. He had nearly assembled the full message, but one line at the bottom remained incomplete, cut short by missing scraps. He dared not speak of it, but the weight of those words pressed upon him like stone. He knew he was being watched, perhaps not by the villagers, but by something else, something that lingered in every shadow of the church. On the 15th of October, the village woke to find the priest himself dead. He had collapsed over his desk, the assembled parchment beneath his hands. His eyes, like the others, were open, his face contorted in final horror. The fragments of the message were stained with spilled wax, but the words were still visible. The villagers crowded the rectory, some weeping, others whispering in terror. The message now read, nearly complete: "You have seen the truth. Now you must go. What was hidden cannot remain hidden. The eye has opened and it will not close until all have looked." Only one piece was missing, the very last scrap. And in the corner of the priest's study, standing silently while the adults argued and wailed, was Annika, her small hands holding something behind her back. When someone finally asked her what she carried, she pulled out the final scrap of parchment. Her eyes were calm, her voice almost too steady as she said, "It wanted me to have this, and now it wants me to tell you what it says." The room fell into silence. The candle flames guttered as though a breath had swept through. The villagers leaned closer, unable to resist, even though every instinct told them not to know, not to listen. Annika unfolded the scrap with careful fingers, placed it on the desk beside the rest, and completed the page. What the final line revealed no one expected.
The candles in Father Dessen's study flickered as if a great wind had passed. Though every door and window was shut tight, the villagers pressed closer, their breaths shallow, eyes drawn like moths to the parchment lying on the desk. Annika's small hand placed the final scrap in its place, and the words that had eluded them for weeks suddenly became whole. A heavy silence followed. It was as if the room itself was listening. The villagers leaned forward, their fear and curiosity wrestling violently within them. Some wanted to look away, to flee, to burn the damned paper before the words could infect their minds. But others, most of them, could not resist. They had to know. The completed page read in full, "You have seen the truth. Now you must go. What was hidden cannot remain hidden. The eye has opened, and it will not close until all have looked. Those who resist will die screaming. Those who accept will die silent. But all must go, for no flesh can hold the sight." The words seemed to pulse on the page, as though the ink were alive. A few villagers gasped. One woman fainted outright. Another made the sign of the cross again and again, muttering prayers under her breath. But the most chilling part was not the words themselves. It was Annika's expression. As she watched the others, her gaze was not frightened, not even curious. It was no. "It doesn't mean leave the village," she said quietly, her voice clear despite the rising panic in the room. "It means leave this life. That's why they all died." A collective shudder went through the gathered crowd. The tailor, Annika's father, clutched her shoulder roughly, as if to shake the madness out of her. "Stop this nonsense, girl. You don't know what you're saying." But Annika only looked up at him with her calm, unsettling eyes. "I do," it told. From that moment, the village was never the same. Some believed the page was cursed, that reading it doomed you. They demanded it be burned at once, destroyed before more deaths followed. But others, gripped by some dark fascination, argued that it held the key to understanding what plagued them. They wanted to study it, to decipher its origins, to know what the eye truly was. The arguments turned violent. That night, in the square, two men fought, until one was left bleeding in the mud. Neighbors accused neighbors of bringing the curse upon them, of consorting with demons, of angering God. Families that had lived side by side for generations now looked upon one another with suspicion. The page sat locked in the priest's chest, but its presence infected every soul. More deaths followed. The blacksmith's wife was found in her bed, rigid, eyes staring at the ceiling beams just as the child Milan had before her. A farmer collapsed in his field, face frozen in terror, a faint whisper of words on his lips, though no one could hear them. Each death was accompanied by a scrap of parchment, though now they were blank, as if mocking the villagers with silence. One night, as the village huddled in their homes, a storm broke out with such force. It rattled every window and threatened to tear the roofs from the houses. Amid the howling wind, a scream carried through the streets, a scream so piercing it seemed to split the storm itself. Those who dared peek from their shutters swore they saw a figure standing at the edge of the woods, tall, impossibly tall, its form shrouded in shadow, its head bent at an unnatural angle as though listening. No one dared step outside. By morning, another villager was dead. Fear turned to desperation. Some attempted to flee, packing their carts and leaving before dawn. But the roads that led out of the village seemed cursed as well. One family, the Kovacs, was found lifeless in their wagon just a mile from home. Horses stood still, unshaken, but every member of the family sat frozen with the same glassy-eyed stare. It was as though death itself had traveled with them, whispering in their ears as they fled. Soon only two choices remained: face whatever haunted them, or die one by one in terror. A small group of villagers, led by the teacher's widower and the miller, decided to confront the source. They believed the forest held the key, for nearly every body had been found near its edge, or gazing toward. They armed themselves with torches, axes and prayers, and set out into the woods. Among them was Annika, who slipped quietly into their ranks. Despite her father's protests, she carried no weapon, no torch, only the parchment page folded neatly in her pocket. The woods were silent as they entered, the storm having passed, but leaving the ground slick with mud. No birds called, no wind stirred. It was as if the forest itself was holding its breath. Deeper they went, past twisted trees and roots that seemed to writhe underfoot, until they reached a clearing none of them remembered seeing before. At its center stood a stone altar, blackened with age, etched with the same symbols that adorned the cursed page. One of the men, a devout woodcutter, fell to his knees, insisting they leave at once. But Annika stepped forward, her eyes fixed on the altar. She pulled the parchment from her pocket and laid it upon the stone. The words on the page glowed faintly, as though feeding on the night. Then they heard it, a whisper, soft at first, like wind through reeds, then louder, layered, as though 1,000 voices spoke at once. You have seen the truth, now you must go. The men clapped their hands over their ears, some dropping their torches in terror. The light dimmed, as though swallowed by the dark. Annika stood unflinching. Show me, she said, and something did. Those who survived claimed the sky above the clearing split open, not with light, not with storm, but with an eye vast, lidless, unblinking, filling the heavens with its terrible gaze. It had no color, no pupil, and yet every man felt it, looking directly at him, peeling away flesh, bone, thought, soul. The weight of its sight crushed them. Some screamed and ran into the woods, never to be seen again. Others dropped where they stood, lifeless, faces locked in the same horror that had claimed so many before. Through it all, Annika did not move. She stood in the center of the clearing, staring back into the endless eye above. Her lips moved as though speaking, but no one could hear the words. When the sky closed and darkness returned, she was gone. Only the parchment remained, smoldering on the stone, its words consumed by fire that left no ash. The survivors staggered back to the village, broken men. They told their tale in fragments, each version more fevered than the last, but one detail never changed. Annika had vanished, taken or chosen, and the eye had seen them all. In the weeks that followed, the death slowed. No more scraps of parchment appeared. The air seemed lighter, the nights less oppressive. Some dared hope the curse had lifted with Annika's disappearance. Yet, not all were convinced. Those who had stood in the clearing swore they still felt the gaze in their dreams, a pressure behind their eyes that grew stronger with every passing night. A few were found dead in their beds, silent, eyes open. Families left, unwilling to test whether the curse was truly over. Within months, only a handful of stubborn souls remained. The church fell into disrepair, the mill silent, the schoolhouse abandoned. The village became a ghost of itself, a place travelers avoided, whispering of the deaths that no one could explain. And somewhere deep in the forest, the black stone altar still stood. Some said they saw a child wandering near it, her eyes too old for her face, watching silently from the shadows. The parchment was gone, the priest was gone, but the truth remained. The eye had opened, and it never closed.
Years passed, and the village at the edge of the Carpathian woods faded into silence. Roofs collapsed under the weight of snow. Ivy crept up the walls, and the fields turned wild with thorn and bramble. The road that once carried merchants and pilgrims grew rough and unused, until only hunters and the occasional desperate traveler wandered that way. The village had become a place of whispers, a name passed in hushed tones among neighboring towns, a warning told to children to keep them from straying too far into the woods. But silence never holds forever. In the spring of 1903, a team of scholars from Vienna arrived in the region. They were historians, folklorists, seekers of old truths buried under myth. Among them was Professor Heinrich Adler, a man whose obsession with the occult had cost him his reputation among more cautious academics. He had heard rumors of the village, rumors of cursed parchment, unexplainable deaths, and an altar deep in the forest. For him it was not just a tale but a challenge, a puzzle demanding to be solved. He brought with him two assistants, a linguist named Marta, and a young doctor named Elias, as well as a guide from a nearby town who knew the land. They entered the village in early May. The air was warmer, but the place felt colder than the mountain wind. Empty houses stood like hollow skulls, doors swinging loose, windows shattered, a well lay choked with debris, and the church was a ruin of collapsed beams and rotting wood. Yet the strangest thing was the absence of animals. No birds perched on the rooftops, no insects buzzed in the air, not even the faint scurry of a rat. It was a dead place, and yet not silent, for the wind carried a whisper that none could quite name. Professor Adler was thrilled. He scribbled notes furiously, sketching the broken streets, examining the churchyard where cracked headstones leaned drunkenly. His assistants were less eager. Marta clutched her shawl tightly, eyes darting as though she expected the shadows to move. Elias, though skeptical of superstition, could not shake the feeling of being watched. On their first night, they camped in the rectory, its roof partially intact. The professor unpacked his collection of notes and maps, spreading them across a broken table. "This," he said with shining eyes, "is no ordinary curse. It is a record of something seen, something preserved in fragments of parchment. If we find the altar, if we uncover the truth, we may witness a piece of history untouched since ancient times." Marta shuddered. "And if the story of the deaths is true," Adler waved dismissively, "superstition. Villagers die and invent monsters to explain it. We will find the altar, and we will see what frightened them into madness. That is all." Yet as he spoke, the candles sputtered, their flames bending as if a breath passed over them. Elias frowned, but said nothing. The next day, they searched the village. Marta discovered strange carvings on the stones of the well, symbols resembling eyes, scratched deep into the rock as if by desperate hands. Elias found the remains of the schoolhouse, its blackboard still marked with faint chalk words, "Do not look." The message, nearly erased by time, chilled him in a way he could not explain. It was the guide, a weathered man named Janos, who found the path into the forest. "This trail is wrong," he muttered, squinting at the twisted roots and the unnatural curve of the tree. "I walked these woods as a boy. This place. It wasn't here." Still, Adler insisted they follow. The forest was darker than it should have been. Even at midday, the canopy swallowed the light, leaving them to stumble in dim twilight. They walked for hours, and just as doubt began to gnaw, they stepped into the clearing. The altar stood exactly as the old tales described, a blackened stone block, rough-hewn, covered in carvings that writhed with age. Moss clung to its sides, but the symbols were clear. Eyes, dozens of them, overlapping, staring outward into the clearing. Around the base were fragments of parchment, long decayed but still faintly marked with ink. The professor nearly fell to his knees in delight. "This is it," he whispered. "The record, the truth they feared." He brushed the moss away and began to copy the carvings. Marta lingered near the edge of the clearing, arms wrapped tight around herself. Elias examined the air, the silence, the feeling of pressure that seemed to grow the longer they stood there. Janos muttered prayers under his breath, refusing to step closer to the altar. Then Marta gasped. She pointed to the tree line. "There's someone there." The others turned, but saw nothing, only shifting shadows. Marta insisted she had seen a child, a girl, pale-faced, watching them with eyes too wide. Adler scoffed, saying she was tired. Yet Elias caught the faintest sound, the creak of footsteps in leaves, though none stirred. That night, they returned to the village, though none slept easily. Marta dreamed of an eye the size of the sky staring endlessly. Elias awoke in the dark with the sensation that someone stood at his bedside, though when he lit his lantern, the room was empty. Adler, though unbothered, scribbled page after page, his obsession deepening. On the third day, they returned to the clearing with parchment, ink and tools. Adler began to trace the symbols, muttering translations under his breath. "It is a warning," he said, "but also an invitation. To see is to know is to leave. The eye will claim all who deny it." His hands trembled, not with fear but with excitement. As he spoke, Elias noticed something strange. The trees at the edge of the clearing seemed to shift closer, their branches angling inward. The air thickened, pressing against his chest, and in the silence, he heard it again. A whisper, not from one direction, but everywhere. "You have seen the truth, now you must go." Elias staggered back,
Clutching his ears, Marta fell to her knees, sobbing, her eyes fixed on the altar. Janos dropped his torch and ran, disappearing into the woods with frantic shouts. Only Adler remained steady, staring at the altar with fevered eyes. Then it happened. The sky darkened. Though no clouds passed, a tear of light split the heavens, and from it opened a vast, lidless eye. It filled the clearing, its gaze spilling down like weight, crushing breath from lungs. Adler fell to his knees laughing, scribbling with shaking hands. "It's real, it's real," Marta screamed. Elias choked on air that felt too heavy, and the whisper grew louder, 1,000 voices pressing against their minds. Elias collapsed. Marta clawed at her face, begging not to see, and Adler, tears streaming, whispered, "Show me more." The eye, what he saw no words could capture. Cities swallowed in silence, oceans of staring faces, skies that wept blood, the endless void of sight that devoured thought itself. His mind cracked under the weight, but his eyes remained open, drinking in horrors beyond reason. When it closed, darkness returned. The clearing was silent. Marta lay lifeless, eyes wide. Elias gasped weakly, still alive but broken, muttering fragments of words. Adler stood trembling, his face gaunt, his eyes bloodshot, but still grinning with wild triumph. They staggered back to the village, or what remained of it. Janos never returned. Elias soon succumbed, his heart failing in the night. That left only Adler, alone in the ruined rectory, writing feverishly by candle. His notes filled dozens of pages, drawings of eyes, transcriptions of whispers, fragments of visions no sane man should record. His obsession grew until words no longer sufficed. He carved symbols into the walls, into his skin, muttering that the eye had chosen him as witness. Weeks later, a traveler passing through found the village. In the rectory, he discovered Adler's body, slumped at his desk, face frozen in horror. His eyes were wide, staring, and his notebooks lay scattered across the floor. Every page bore the same line written over and over again. "It never closes, it never closes, it never closes." The traveler fled, but he carried one notebook with him. By the time he reached the next town, he was already muttering the words under his breath. The curse had spread, and somewhere, deep in the forest clearing, a child's voice laughed softly, echoing among the trees. The town of Segvar lay 2 days' ride from the abandoned village, a modest place of farmers and cobblers, where gossip traveled faster than grain. When the lone traveler stumbled in with wild eyes and a torn coat, few paid him heed at first. Strangers often came and went, carrying tales too strange to believe. But as the man collapsed in the square, clutching a weathered notebook to his chest, curiosity turned to alarm. They carried him to the inn, and laid him on a bed. His skin was clammy, his lips pale. All through the night he muttered the same phrase in a broken, rasping voice. "It never closes." The innkeeper's wife swore she heard him speak other words too, in tongues she did not recognize, guttural and hissing, yet strangely hypnotic. By dawn, he was dead, his eyes wide, frozen in the same terror the villagers of the cursed place had known. The notebook he clutched was passed first to the constable, then to the priest, then to the curious townsfolk, who crowded into the inn to glimpse it. The leather cover was cracked, the pages inside spattered with ink, and every page was filled with feverish handwriting, sketches of eyes, spirals that seemed to pull one's gaze inward, lines repeated endlessly. "The eye has opened, the eye has opened, the eye has opened." At first, most dismissed it as the ravings of a madman, but a few could not look away. The baker's apprentice found himself staring at one drawing for hours, unable to sleep. A merchant swore the spirals moved when he held the book close to the firelight. The priest warned against obsession, insisting the book was blasphemy, but even he lingered over its pages longer than he admitted. Within days, the first strange death came. The apprentice was found slumped at his workbench, flour scattered across the floor, his eyes wide open, his mouth twisted in terror. By his side lay the notebook, open to a page he had marked the night before. On it was scrawled a phrase not seen elsewhere in the book, as if the ink had appeared on its own. "You looked too long." The town grew restless. Whispers spread of curses, of dark forces in the north wood. The constable ordered the notebook locked in the church, but the key went missing within a night. The next morning, it was discovered in the hands of a farmer's son, who swore he was drawn to it, as if something had called him. He claimed to hear voices whispering from the pages, calling his name. When his father struck him to bring him to his senses, the boy only laughed, a laugh far too deep for his small body, before collapsing lifeless on the spot. Fear spread like some demanded the book be burned, but when they attempted to set fire to it, the pages would not catch. The flames licked the parchment, curling the edges, but the ink glowed faintly and refused to turn to ash. The priest, pale with terror, declared it a test of faith. Others whispered that it was proof the book was alive. By midsummer, Segvar was no longer a town of peace. More deaths followed, each marked by wide eyes and twisted faces. Some claimed they saw a figure watching them from doorways, a girl pale and thin, her gaze far too knowing. Mothers pulled their children inside at night, but children whispered of seeing her in their dreams, beckoning them into the woods. Elias Adler's notes had spread the curse. The government eventually took notice. Rumors of plague reached Budapest, and an inspector was sent to investigate. He arrived with soldiers, determined to dispel superstitions and restore order. But soldiers are men, and men are weak against things they cannot name. Within a week, 2 of them were found dead in their barracks, their rifles still clutched in their arms, their eyes open and unblinking. The inspector himself lasted longer, but his reports grew erratic. He wrote of symbols appearing on the church walls though no one painted them, of whispers in his sleep, of a pressure behind his eyes that made him bleed when he prayed. His final letter ended with a blot of ink, and a single word: watching. After his disappearance no further inspectors came. Segvar was left to its fate. Families fled, carrying little more than what they could carry on their backs. Yet even those who escaped found no peace. Letters from neighboring villages told of wanderers who arrived muttering strange phrases, drawing eyes in the dirt, whispering to themselves until they too collapsed in silent terror. The curse was no longer bound to a single place. It traveled through words, through memory, through sight itself. And always, there were whispers of the girl. She was seen near rivers, on back roads, in forests, always at a distance, always watching. Some swore she was Annika, the child who had vanished a decade before, unchanged by time. Others insisted she was not a girl at all but the Eye's messenger wearing human skin to lure the living. Wherever she appeared, death soon followed. In autumn of 1905, a group of monks attempted to end the spreading blood. They carried the book, wrapped in chains and cloth, to a monastery high in the mountains. There they performed rituals of purification, prayers that lasted 7 days and nights. On the 8th night, the monastery burned. Travelers, who passed the ruins later swore the smoke rose in the shape of a vast, unblinking eye, and in the ash lay only fragments of parchment, words burned into stone itself. It never closes. The curse endured. As the years went on, Segvar ceased to exist. Houses collapsed, fields grew wild. The few who remained were not truly alive, empty shells that wandered the streets, whispering to themselves, eyes always open. Travelers avoided the region altogether. Maps stopped marking the town. Yet sometimes, when the wind was still, one could hear laughter drifting from the ruins, a child's laughter, light and cruel. But the Eye's hunger was not sated. Far to the west, in Prague, a rare book collector acquired one of Adler's notebooks from a frightened trader. He displayed it proudly in his study, boasting of its mysterious origins. Guests at his dinners marveled at its strange symbols, its hypnotic drawing. Within a year, his household was gone, servants dead, his wife vanished, and he himself found rigid in his chair, eyes wide, mouth open in a final scream. The notebook lay open on his desk, its final page filled with a new phrase none had ever seen before: all must look. And so it spread, piece by piece, page by page. Some burned the notebooks, some locked them away. But the Eye did not need paper to endure. It needed only memory, retelling, the gaze of one human upon another. The curse was no longer a story of one village. It was a story of anyone who heard, anyone who dared to look too long. Yet still, in the shadows of forgotten places, Annika lingered. She appeared to those who were most curious, most willing to look. Sometimes, she guided them deeper into the woods, where their screams never returned. Sometimes she only watched, her pale face calm, her lips whispering words no one could hear. She was neither child nor ghost, but something else. A witness, perhaps, or a presence was always followed by silence, and then by death. By 1910, whispers of the eye had spread far beyond Hungary. Scholars wrote of it cautiously, disguised in allegory, afraid to name it directly. Travelers warned of cursed towns where everyone died with their eyes open, and in secret circles, men and women sought it out, believing the eye to be a gateway to truth, to knowledge beyond mortal limits. They met in hidden chambers, drawing spirals on walls, chanting words found in Adler's pages. Some vanished, some went mad, others returned with eyes that never blinked, even in sleep. It was not merely a curse anymore, it had become a faith, the Crimson Sect, they called themselves, a cult born from the ruins of a village no map remembered. Their symbol was an unblinking eye painted in blood, their prayers the fragments of the parchment that had doomed so many. They spread across Europe quietly, feeding on curiosity, on those too eager to see what should not be seen. Wherever they gathered, strange deaths followed, and always, at the heart of their meetings, stood a child, pale, ageless, her gaze calm and knowing. Annika. She did not lead them, yet they followed. She did not speak, yet they obeyed. And in their dreams, every one of them saw the same thing. The sky tearing open, the endless eye gazing down. It never closed, and now, more were looking every.
Darkness had fallen over the village, but no one dared to step outside after sundown. Doors were bolted, candles flickered in silence, and the atmosphere had grown so suffocating that even whispers carried like screams. By now 5 nights had passed since the first bodies were discovered, and every passing hour seemed heavier than the last. Fear had woven itself into the daily rhythm of life, replacing laughter with paranoia and routine with dread. The curse had claimed too many, and the villagers knew that it was not finished, yet they could not leave either. The fear of whatever lurked outside the village gates seemed just as overwhelming as the terror within. They were trapped, prisoners, of a mystery that refused to reveal itself. Detective Samuel, who had chosen to remain despite repeated warnings, walked through the narrow alleyways in the late hours, lantern in one hand, notebook in the other. His shadow stretched unnaturally long across the mud brick walls, giving the illusion that something stalked him silently from behind. He paused every few steps, his trained ears alert to the faintest sound. Somewhere, a dog barked once, and then went silent, as though choked into submission. Somewhere else, the soft cry of an infant broke into the stillness, quickly muffled by a mother who feared that even noise could invite death into her home. Samuel noted these things not with curiosity, but with the growing realization that the entire village had become a living tomb, and he was walking among the condemned. He returned to the small room he had taken as his temporary lodging, where the surviving girl, Eliza, sat curled in the corner. She had barely spoken since he found her near the last set of bodies, clutching her doll with lifeless eyes. But tonight, Samuel noticed something different about her posture. She was not trembling like before. Instead, she seemed to be listening, tilting her head as if she could hear something he could not. He asked softly, "What is it, Eliza?" She raised her hand and pointed to the window. Her lips moved, and for the first time in days, sound came out. "They're not gone," she whispered. Samuel's blood chilled, but before he could ask who they were, the lantern flickered and went out, plunging the room into darkness. Samuel fumbled to relight it, his match trembling in his hand, but in that span of seconds, he heard it. The faint scraping of something against the walls outside. It was deliberate, measured, like fingernails dragging across stone. Eliza began to hum quietly, the same eerie lullaby she had sung when Samuel first met her. The sound was haunting in the darkness, and Samuel realized with horror that she was not afraid. She was welcoming it. When the lantern flared back to life, the room was unchanged, but the window bore fresh scratches, long and jagged, as though marked from the outside by an unseen hand. The next morning, another body was found at the edge of the field. The victim was an elderly farmer who had gone out before dawn to check his livestock. There was no blood, no visible wound, but his face was contorted into the same grotesque mask of terror as the other.
His mouth hung open in a silent scream, and his eyes were wide, frozen in a way that suggested he had seen something so unbearable that his soul had been forced out of his body. Near his hand lay a piece of parchment, weathered and stained. On it were scrawled the same words as before: "You have seen the truth. Now you must leave." Samuel picked it up carefully, turning it over, searching for anything unusual. Unlike the others, this parchment seemed newer, as though it had not been buried in time like the rest. The ink was fresh, the strokes deliberate. This was not an ancient curse, passed down through generations. Someone alive was orchestrating it, or worse, someone was aiding whatever force had cursed the village. As he pocketed the parchment, Samuel felt eyes on him. He turned sharply, but no one stood nearby. Still, he could not shake the sensation that unseen watchers followed his every move. By afternoon, the villagers gathered in the square. Panic had reached its breaking point. They shouted, demanding answers, some begging Samuel to save them, others accusing him of bringing misfortune. A man stepped forward from the crowd, his voice trembling with fury. "Ever since this outsider came, more of us have died," he writes in his book. He whispers with that cursed child, and yet he tells us nothing. How do we know he is not the cause? Others joined in, their fear turning into mob anger. Samuel raised his hands to calm them, but before he could speak, Eliza appeared at his side, clutching his coat. Her small, clear voice cut through the chaos. "He's not the one. They don't want him dead yet." The square fell silent at her words. Villagers exchanged horrified glances, and murmurs rippled through the crowd. Samuel stared at her, stunned, but Eliza only stared straight ahead with unblinking eyes. That night, Samuel resolved to test his growing theory. If someone was deliberately placing the parchments, he needed to catch them in the act. He hid among the shadows near the fields, where the last victim had fallen. The air was unnaturally still, the silence pressing against his ears. Hours passed, and nothing moved, until at last he heard footsteps, slow, careful, but unmistakable. A figure emerged from the mist, cloaked and hooded, holding something in their hand. Samuel's heart pounded as he watched them kneel near a fence post, placing a folded parchment deliberately into the dirt. He crept closer, his every muscle taut with anticipation, until a twig snapped beneath his boot. The figure froze. Slowly they turned their head, and Samuel saw beneath the hood, not a stranger, but a villager he had seen grieving earlier that day. Before Samuel could call out, the figure vanished into the mist, dissolving like smoke. He rushed to the spot where the parchment lay, and unfolded it. The words were the same, but something new had been added beneath. "You are close. Do not look further." His breath caught. This was not simply a warning to the villagers. It was directed at him. Someone or something knew he was watching, and it was not afraid to confront him. When he returned, Eliza was waiting for him at the door. Her eyes gleamed faintly in the lantern light, too old and knowing for a child her age. "You shouldn't have gone," she said softly. Samuel knelt down, gripping her shoulders. "Who is doing this? Eliza, tell me what you saw that night." She hesitated, her lips trembling, then whispered, "They showed me. They opened the ground, and I saw the faces underneath. They've always been here, buried, waiting, and now they're awake." Samuel felt a chill run down his spine. He wanted to dismiss her words as the ramblings of trauma, but something in her gaze told him she was not imagining it. She had seen something real, something beyond human comprehension. That night, as he lay awake, Samuel began to hear faint noises beneath the floorboards of his room. At first, it was just scratching, but then came muffled cries, desperate and anguished, as though voices were rising from the earth itself. He pressed his ear to the floor, his heart hammering, and what he heard next nearly broke him. His own name, whispered in a chorus of voices that did not belong to the living. He staggered back, clutching his head, and the voices faded into silence. But sleep never came. He realized that the curse was not just a string of murders. It was a message, and he was becoming a part of it. By dawn, Samuel knew the deaths were far from over. The curse had not yet chosen its final victim, and for reasons he could not yet understand, it was saving him for last. The sixth night weighed heavily upon Samuel, as though time itself had slowed into something unbearable. He sat at the edge of his bed, staring at the parchment he had retrieved from the field. The ink seemed to shimmer faintly in the dim lantern light, as though alive, as though the words, "You are close, do not look further," had been written, not just to warn him, but to mock him. He could not sleep. Every creak of the floorboards, every groan of the old wood, pressed down on him, like a reminder that he was surrounded. Even Eliza, who had curled herself tightly into the far corner, seemed less like a child, and more like a vessel carrying truths, too heavy for her fragile body. Her eyes never closed. She stared at the wall, humming softly, her doll clutched in her pale hands. Samuel could not sit idle anymore. He decided that tonight he would search beneath the village. Eliza's words about the ground opening, about the faces she had seen, had rooted themselves in his mind. He recalled the muffled cries he had heard under the floorboards, the whispers that carried his name, and the scratching that came with the whatever truth lay there, buried and waiting. He needed to face it. He gathered his lantern, notebook, and a spade, tucking them into a satchel. As he opened the door to leave, Eliza's voice broke the silence. "If you go down, you won't come back the same." Her words chilled him, but Samuel only replied, "Then I must know what waits." She didn't argue, but her humming grew louder, almost like a farewell. The village slept under a blanket of dread. He moved silently through the alleys, until he reached the old chapel at the village's end. It had long been abandoned. Its roof sagged, its doors rotted, but Samuel had noticed something peculiar the day before. The earth near its foundation seemed disturbed, as though dug up and recovered. The chapel itself bore markings on its outer walls, faint carvings that looked eerily similar to the ones on the parchments. Lantern light revealed them more clearly now, symbols of binding, sealing and watching. These weren't decorations, they were warnings, wards meant to keep something from escaping. Samuel entered cautiously. The chapel smelled of mold and decay. Broken pews lay scattered across the floor, and a once grand altar stood crooked, its surface marred by deep scratches. He swept his lantern slowly across the ground, until he found it, a trapdoor hidden beneath warped planks, the iron ring, rusted, but intact. His pulse quickened. He set the lantern down, gripped the ring, and pulled with all his strength. The door creaked open, releasing a breath of air, so foul and ancient, it made his eyes water. It smelled of damp earth, and something else, something rotting, but not entirely dead. With his spade strapped across his back, Samuel descended the narrow ladder into the blackness. The lantern's glow revealed walls lined with stone, slick with moisture, and carved with more of those strange markings. The passage stretched downward into a tunnel that seemed to have no end. Every step echoed unnaturally, as though the sound of his boots on stone was being carried deeper than the space allowed. He reached a chamber at last, a cavernous space, where the air was colder than winter. The walls here were different, etched with faces, hundreds of them, carved into the stone with such detail that Samuel swore some of them blinked as he passed. The faces were twisted in agony, mouths open wide in eternal screams. His lantern light revealed mounds scattered across the floor. He bent down and realized with horror, they were bones, piles of them, broken and jumbled, some still bearing fragments of clothing that looked far too recent to have decayed naturally. At the center of the chamber lay a pit, its edges rough, its depth unfathomable. Samuel approached cautiously, peering into the abyss. He expected only darkness, but instead, he saw movement. Shapes, pale and writhing, shifted far below, as though bodies were trapped in mud, but still alive. He staggered back, clutching his lantern, when a sound rose from the pit, a chorus of whispers, hundreds of voices layered together, speaking words that made his skin crawl. His own name surfaced again, repeated over and over. Samuel. The voices begged, pleaded, commanded. He dropped to his knees, covering his ears, but the sound was inside his skull, vibrating in his bones. Suddenly, one voice broke through the others, louder, clearer. It was Eliza's. "You shouldn't have come here." He looked around frantically, but she was nowhere near. Only the pit remained before him, seething with unseen horrors. In that moment, he understood. The parchments, the warnings, the faces, they were not mere symbols. This place was the heart of the curse, the womb from which the horror had been birthed. Someone in the village had been tending to it, feeding it, ensuring it stayed alive by offering victims that someone had left the parchments as both warnings and rituals, binding the curse tighter with each death. The curse wasn't mindless, it had intent, and now it knew Samuel had found its source. A sudden rumble shook the ground beneath him. The walls trembled, dust falling from the ceiling. Samuel stumbled back, clutching his lantern as the pit began to stir violently. From its depths rose a figure, not whole but shifting, incomplete, as though it was made of the faces he had seen carved into the walls. They melded together, forming a mass that twisted and groaned, countless mouths opening and closing, countless eyes staring directly at him. It dragged itself upward, clawing at the edges of the pit, trying to rise into the chamber. Samuel's instinct screamed at him to run, but his body froze. He forced himself to move, to scramble toward the tunnel, his lantern swinging wildly. The ground shook harder, the whispers escalating into screams. He barely managed to climb the ladder, slamming the trapdoor shut above him. His chest heaved, his body drenched in sweat. He pressed his back against the altar, listening. The sounds below quieted, but he knew the thing had not gone back to sleep. It had awoken, and it would not rest again. When he staggered back into the village, dawn had just broken. The first rays of light pierced the mist, but they brought no relief. Villagers emerged from their homes, pale and hollow-eyed. Samuel knew what he had to tell them, but the truth would only destroy them further. As he opened his mouth to speak, Eliza appeared again, standing at the edge of the crowd. Her doll dangled loosely in her hand. She looked directly at him and said, loud enough for all to hear, "He found it, now it will come." A murmur of panic swept through the villagers. Some began to cry, others cursed Samuel openly, demanding he leave. They no longer saw him as a savior, but as the harbinger of their doom. Samuel tried to calm them, explaining what he had seen, the pit beneath the chapel, the faces in the stone, but his words only deepened their terror. One man spat at his feet. "If you brought this curse upon us, then you must end it, or we'll end you." The villagers dispersed in chaos, retreating into their homes. Samuel was left standing in the empty square, the weight of their hatred pressing upon him. He returned to his room, where Eliza waited. She spoke before he could. "It won't stop until it takes enough. The ground remembers every life that ever touched it. You woke it, and now it's hungry." Samuel sat heavily, burying his face in his hands. He thought of the parchment's warning, "Do not look further." He had looked, and in doing so, he had given the curse strength. He realized now that every death had been feeding it, and every warning had been an attempt to keep curious hands away from its prison. But someone in the village had betrayed them all, serving the pit willingly, ensuring its hunger was never left unsatisfied. Night fell again, and with it came screams. This time, multiple voices at once, echoing from different parts of the village. Samuel rushed into the streets, lantern in hand, only to find doors swinging open, blood smeared across thresholds, and bodies left where they had fallen. The curse had broken free from its confines. It no longer waited for offerings. It was taking what it wanted. Through the chaos, Samuel saw Eliza standing still in the middle of the street, while others ran. She did not move. She looked almost serene, her hair flowing in the night breeze. When Samuel reached her, she turned her head slowly, and whispered, "It chose you. That's why it hasn't taken you yet. You're the one it wants most." His breath caught in his chest. Before he could respond, the ground beneath them rumbled once more, cracks splitting the earth, as though the village itself was tearing apart. From those cracks came the same pale shapes, reaching, crawling, dragging themselves into the world above. The curse had risen fully now, and the night was just beginning.
The child's breathing echoed in the empty hall, shallow and uneven, as if she carried the whole weight of the mystery inside her fragile chest. Eliza had become the last remaining witness of a string of deaths that no one could explain. The town had long stopped speaking about it in open daylight, and even the most rational men had begun to murmur in low voices about curses, ancient pacts, and things not meant to be seen. Inspector Dalton, though hardened by years of grim duty, could not silence the gnawing doubt that coiled itself around his thoughts whenever he read the case files. Each photograph of the 7 bodies was a mirror of confusion, eyes wide open, faces twisted in terror, yet untouched by blade, poison or disease. There was no sign of violence, yet each expression screamed of something worse than pain. He found himself staring at the girl who now sat in silence, in the custody room, a candle flickering between them. She was clutching the ragged piece of paper that had been found on every corpse. The words scribbled in trembling ink. "You have seen the truth. Now you must leave." Dalton asked her once again to tell him what she saw, but her lips quivered, and instead of answering, she began to hum a lullaby, off-key, broken, like something learned from a voice that was no longer alive. Her eyes drifted to the ceiling, following shapes only she could see. Dalton shuddered, for in that moment, the temperature seemed to drop, his breath a mist in the cold air of the room. He reminded himself this was only a child, traumatized and perhaps delusional, but deep inside he knew that what she had seen was not merely the product of fear. The investigation had become a haunting maze. Dalton traced every thread, interrogated every villager, examined every inch of the ground where the bodies were found. But the more he uncovered, the more the facts rebelled against logic. The victims, though unrelated, had all passed near the old church on the edge of town in the final hours before their deaths. The church, abandoned for half a century, stood like a shadow against the skyline, its spire bent, its doors chained. Rumors claimed it had once housed forbidden rites, led by a sect that was erased from records. Dalton had dismissed these stories at first as village superstition, but when he found a fresh footprint leading to its locked door, he knew he could not ignore it any longer. One night, lantern in hand, he approached the church alone. The silence around it was suffocating. No owl, no wind, no rustling of trees, just the hollow stillness of stone and dust. He broke the chains, the sound echoing far into the night, and stepped inside. The air was thick, stale, filled with the weight of centuries. The pews were splintered, the altar cracked, but the walls were covered in faint drawings that seemed to crawl the longer he looked. Strange circles, human figures with no eyes and lines that twisted like veins across the stone. In the center of the floor was a mark, charred into the ground, impossible to erase. Dalton felt the ground tremble under his boots, as if something deep beneath the church was awake. His lantern flickered violently and then went. He struck a match, hands shaking, and for a brief moment he swore he saw 7 figures standing in the aisles, faces pale, eyes wide open, the same as the corpses. They whispered in unison, a breathless chant, "You have seen the truth. Now you must leave." His match died, plunging him into darkness, and when he relit the lantern, the figures were gone, but the mark on the ground seemed to glow faintly, pulsing like a heartbeat. Dalton stumbled backward, almost fleeing, until he reached the outside air again, where he collapsed against the cold earth. The words repeated in his head, not as an echo but as if they had been etched into his skull. Back at the station, Dalton tried to compose his notes, but every line broke into fragments. He could not describe what he saw without his hand trembling. When he looked at Eliza again, he realized she was watching him with an understanding that cut him deep. She finally spoke, her voice cracked, but steady. "They show you, and then they wait." Dalton leaned forward, asking her who they were, but she shook her head. "Not people, not anymore. They wanted to be remembered, and the ones who looked, they remembered too much." Dalton asked why she was still alive. Her answer chilled him. "Because I did not look away. They let me stay so I would tell." The following days turned into a blur of sleepless nights. Dalton tried to contact experts, priests, even traveling scholars, but none offered solutions, only warnings. Some told him to burn the church, others to seal it forever, and a few said it should be left alone, untouched, because tampering with it would bring more death. The townsfolk began abandoning their homes, shops closed, windows boarded, carriages leaving at dusk. A once vibrant village became a hollow shell. Dalton, though tempted to leave as well, felt chained to the truth. He was not a man of faith, nor one easily shaken, but he could not deny what he had seen. On the 7th night,
Since his visit to the church, the dreams began. He dreamt of the 7 corpses lying in a circle, their mouths moving silently, their eyes unblinking. Eliza stood in the center of the circle, her voice rising in the same broken lullaby, and behind her, the walls stretched into endless darkness, where the drawings moved as if alive. He woke drenched in sweat, only to find the paper with the cursed phrase lying on his desk. Though he had locked it away, his rational mind screamed of trickery, but the fear rooting in his chest whispered otherwise. He decided he must confront it, end it, whatever it was. Dalton returned to the church with Eliza by his side, against his better judgment, but the girl insisted she was meant to be there. They entered together, the air heavier than before. The mark on the ground now burned brighter, illuminating the drawings, as though they were veins of fire. The 7 figures appeared again, clearer than before, their whisper filling every corner of the building. Eliza stepped forward, fearless, and spoke to them, words Dalton could not understand. The whisper ceased, and for a moment, there was silence so profound it pressed against their eardrum. Then the mark cracked open, releasing a rush of air that smelled of earth and ash. From the fissure, voices emerged, countless, layered, speaking in languages lost to time. Dalton staggered, covering his ears, but Eliza only stood taller, as if absorbing their sound. The fissure widened, and Dalton glimpsed something he would never describe fully, a movement of shapes, not bound by form, eyes without faces, mouths without bodies. He stumbled back, ready to flee, but Eliza turned to him, her eyes now glowing faintly. "You see now," she said. "You cannot unknow it." The figures vanished, the fissure sealed itself, and the church fell into silence again, though the air still vibrated with the residue of what had been. Dalton, gasping, demanded answers, but Eliza only repeated the phrase, "You have seen the truth. Now you must leave." He realized then the meaning was not only a curse, but a law. Those who saw could not remain unchanged. Eliza, somehow bound to the force, had become both witness and messenger. Dalton, broken by what he saw, knew his life would never return to normal. He could not explain the deaths, nor could he file a report that anyone would accept. The truth had carved itself into him, invisible, but permanent. He left the village the next morning, but wherever he went, the whispers followed, faint but constant, reminding him of the curse. Years later, when his health declined, and his mind began to slip, he was found dead at his desk, eyes wide open, a ragged piece of paper clenched in his hand. It bore the same words as the others. "You have seen the truth. Now you must leave." The village was eventually erased from maps, its name forgotten, its ruins overtaken by weeds. Travelers spoke of a silence there that unsettled horses, and made even the boldest men avoid the path. And sometimes they said, if one lingered too long, a child's broken lullaby could be heard, echoing faintly through the air, a song for the dead who had seen too much. They thought it was over, but was it? 7 bodies, wide open eyes, no wounds, no answer. A village erased by fear, a curse written on scraps of paper, and a silence that still screams in the dark. The truth, maybe no one will ever know, or maybe the truth is waiting for the next one who dares to step inside those ruins. This was the Crimson Truth, where nightmares are real, and reality is worse. Don't close your eyes tonight, because they